Welcome aboard, everyone. My name is Ricardo. I'm part of Zoom's marketing team. As mentioned, I'm located in Oakland, California. We're slated for about 45, maybe even 55 minutes total in today's webinar. We are using Zoom's webinar platform in order to deliver today's session to you. A couple of details about the webinar environment, just in case this might be your very first time joining us in a Zoom webinar. Focus on the bottom left side of your screen for just a couple of seconds. Notice that you do not have a video option like you normally would in a Zoom meeting. This means that you're not on video. So you can certainly sit back and relax for today's webinar. We cannot see you. As much as we would love to see all of you over video, video is simply not an option for you in the webinar environment. We cannot hear you on top of that. So you join the webinar muted, but that doesn't mean that you cannot interact, right? A lot of you, and thank you for interacting with us, are using the chat panel. So let's use chat in the spirit of interactivity. When our guest speaker provides you with some sort of a scenario that he would like for you to respond to via chat, you'll use chat. I kindly ask you to not send questions in the chat panel because we have a lot of people in today's webinar. We don't want to lose that question. We have provided you with a Q&A option at the bottom of your screen. So we have some options available to you in the bottom middle of your screen. There's a Q&A option. And this is where you're going to send your questions. And what we'll do is we'll utilize those questions for some live Q&A during the webinar. We might take some pauses and my guest speaker will address me and I can feed some of those questions to him and then we can keep those questions coming, right? So let's use Q&A in the spirit of having you pose our questions or your questions to us. We are recording the webinar for you as well. So post-webinar, if not today, certainly tomorrow, you're going to receive a follow-up email. The email will contain a link to today's recording. One extra thing that I want to mention is I'm going to be sending you resources in your chat panel pertaining to our guest speaker today. The detail about the chat panel in the webinar environment is that you are not able to copy or save the content of chat. All you have to do is click on those links that I send to you and they will open up for you in a separate browser. Those links will also be captured in the recording for you. So just in case you want to not click on anything, that's okay. When you play back the recording, you'll see the directory of links that I've sent to you. Just copy them, paste them into a new browser, and then you'll have access to those resources, okay? With that being said, I am very humbly privileged to host today's guest speaker for us today. Chunka Mui, a futurist and innovation advisor, believes that the best way to predict the future is to invent it. That is awesome. His latest book, A Brief History of a Perfect Future, Inventing the World We Can Proudly Leave Our Kids by 2050, explores how we can harness the vast potential of rapidly advancing science, technology, and human ingenuity to co-create a better collective future with greater health, sustainability, and prosperity. Chunka has advised hundreds of organizations and studied thousands more. He has co-authored 4 other award-winning books on strategy and innovation. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my absolute pleasure to have Chunka Mui join us in today's webinar. We want you to sit back, relax, and enjoy today's session. And it's my privilege to pass it over to Chunka. Over to you.
Thank you, Ricardo. Thank you very much. And I want to say also thank you to everyone who signed on. I know your time is really valuable, and I really appreciate you being here, both Ricardo and I, and we want to make this experience as valuable for you as possible. And I marvel, I really marvel at the wide geographical diversity of the participants. Just imagine 5 years ago, how much it would have cost to bring us all together in this kind of form, or even if it was even possible 10 years ago. So that's it's part of the power of Zoom and platforms like it that make this possible. So I want to start with a story, a personal story. It involves my daughter, Zoe, and a few years ago, I was coming back from a conference where I was speaking to a number of industry executives. And my daughter said, well, what did you do, Dad? What were you trying to do? And I tried to explain that I was talking to these executives about this industrial revolution that we're experiencing around this massive connectivity of devices and artificial intelligence and all the advanced technology that we were able to take advantage of across all these different industries. And I was trying to explain to Zoe my focus in terms of helping organizations, helping industry look at this intersection of strategy, technology, and innovation, and how they could, in their organizations, take competitive advantage of that. How could they drive growth? How can they drive profits? All of those kinds of things. And Zoe sort of looked at me for a second and said, well, Dad, you've written all these different books about this kind of stuff, you know, your killer apps and driverless cars and all this. And I know that you're really, really, really interested in how companies work and how to help your clients. But I have a question. So you're a futurist. Well, I hope that you adults don't mess mine up. I hope that you adults don't mess my future up. How are you going to do that? Not mess up my future. And that really struck me. And it made me think about this question of, as we think about sort of business and competitive advantage, what are we doing to our children's kids? And actually, I'd like to ask Ricardo to pull up a poll and ask you to think about this. Do you think that we adults, as my 14-year-old daughter referred to us at the time, are in danger of messing up our children's future? And this poll is completely anonymous. Please just give me your quick thoughts on it. Yes, we are messing up our children's future. No, we're not really in danger of doing that. Yes, lots of people coming through the chat. Ricardo, if you can, please feel free to bring up the results as they go, if we can. Yeah. Overwhelming number of us. Please feel free to add your thoughts. Yes. As one participant says, think about what Zoe says often, right? That kind of thing. So 87% are on the yes side. And of course, you know, this is the danger of it. It's not a prediction of the future. It's what we're worried about. And I think as parents, we're often worried about, you know, the legacy we leave behind, even if we're on a day-to-day basis looking at, you know, what we have to do right in front of us. So that was a very bracing moment for me, right? For have my child to ask me about this. And that launch is essentially a 4-year effort on my part to study this question, right? How can we adults build a future that we can proudly leave to our kids? And that's the focus of my most recent book. And that's the focus of this talk. Because in the course of the research for that book and the course of my thinking and trying to understand that I came to the conclusion that what we had in front of us is an opportunity not only to deal with our short term, our immediate attempt to create competitive advantage for ourselves and the businesses that we've worked for, but we have the biggest personal and professional opportunity of our lifetimes, because we have the opportunity to take that effort and not think about just competitive advantage, but think about the purpose of our organizations and how to take that combination of advantage and purpose and apply it to the biggest societal problems in front of us. And the intersection of those three circles is what we've referred to in the book as the future perfect, the best possible world that we can create out of the opportunities that we have. So the driving narrative of this book and driving narrative of this talk is a quote from Alan Kay, who was one of the inventors of the personal computer, one of the most brilliant technology thinkers of our time, who said essentially, the best way to predict the future is to invent it. the best way to predict the future is to invent it. So what I want to do is to offer three lessons, right? Offer three lessons from my book and my research to help you think about how you can invent the future. So I'm going to dive right into it. Lesson number one is to make a third list. And what do I mean by that? Many of us have to-do lists, daily lists, weekly lists, the things we have to get done today and things we have to get done on sort of a short-term basis. Rahm Emanuel, who was the chief of staff to President Obama and mayor of Chicago for a number of years, I grew up in Chicago, tells a story about how he also kept these lists. He kept a daily list and a weekly list. He would have one in each coat pocket. You know, the things he had to do today, had to make sure the city did today. Fix potholes, clear the streets, clear the snow, pick up the garbage, things we have to do on a weekly basis. Emanuel also had what he called a third list. And these were the things that represented his aspirations, right? His aspirations for the city of Chicago. These were the things that would take a long time to accomplish, maybe not even accomplishable in his time as mayor of Chicago, but they were the sort of things that he knew that he could work towards in his time as mayor, or if he didn't do the right things, he could preclude from happening. Right, he would stop them from happening because he would take the city down a different course. And they were things like the modernization of O'Hare, how to deal with Chicago's underfunded pensions. He also had this aspiration of providing free universal preschool to all the city's children, or fixing infrastructure, creating sustainability. These were things that he knew that he could have a material effect on, but he couldn't actually finish in his time. But if he didn't do it, they probably wouldn't get done at all. So a great example of that is the Chicago Riverwalk. How many of you have been to Chicago? How many of you have walked on the Chicago Riverwalk? It bisects the downtown area, and it's this beautiful promenade of shops and walking areas and parks along the river. It's absolutely gorgeous. Much of it was facilitated and built in Rahm Emanuel's time. There's a story that Rahm Emanuel was so fixated on Chicago Riverwalk that he made himself, whenever he went to a meeting in downtown Chicago, rather than taking his police entourage in their cars, he would walk from place to place in the city and make him walk along the river to remind him of what he wanted to accomplish down there. Now, as I said, I grew up on the south side of Chicago, and as I was growing up, this is what the Chicago River looked like. It was essentially a sewer, a cesspool, right? I lived near the Chicago Stockyards. Carcasses of cows would be in the river. And there were decades where you had to have tetanus shots before you got near the river. And the only thing that happened of interest in the Chicago River was that once a year, rather than being filthy, slimy green, it was this fluorescent green because they colored it for St. Patrick's Day. But a succession of mayors before Rahm Emanuel, and including him, had this vision of turning this concrete jungle, which was the picture on your left, into what's there today. There was a plan created in the 1990s after almost a decade of work on how the Chicago River corridor could be migrated from what you see on the left and see on the right. And a succession of mayors using that plan did everything they could on an incremental basis year over year to gradually move over towards the Chicago River. They would do things like every time a landowner wanted to do some reconstruction on a building and needed zoning approval, they made building or enhancing their part of the river one of the criteria. Or whenever there were government grants that might be able to build a part of this river walk, they would apply for these grants. So it would take over years and years and years. They gradually went from what's on the left to what's on the right. It was on their third list. None of those mayors were able to build the Riverwalk by themselves, but through that long-term thinking, they were able to create this major transformation. So this notion of a third list is key to inventing the future, because the future doesn't happen overnight. It happens incrementally over time, as long as you're going towards the right goal. So that's the most important lesson. Right? First lesson, you have to have a long-term view and have that third list always on your mind as you're going. The second lesson I want to impart upon you is this notion of, as you're working on that third list, you can work under the assumption that the tools that you have over time will get better and better and cheaper and cheaper. Many of these tools will follow what I call, my co-authors and I call, the laws of zero. And there are 7 laws of zero, 7 building blocks of the future that we think are really, really powerful. There are others as well, but these I want to focus on in today's talk. And they are both technology and infrastructure and resources. So computing, networks, information, but also science and medicine embodied in genomics, how we deal with water, energy, transportation. And let me give you some examples of that. So all these capabilities, all these tools have for decades following what I call an exponential progression. Right? Over time, they get better and better at exponential level, while society and systems tend to change on an incremental level. So as that gap between what's possible and what's tend to happen on an incremental basis grows, the opportunity for disruptive change increases over time. So if you have the right view on your goal and a right sense of the tools and the capabilities increasing, over time you can do more and more against your goals. So the other aspect of this exponential change in capability is that on a relative cost standpoint, the costs decrease exponentially as well, right? That's why we're able to get together today at almost zero incremental costs, whereas 10 years ago it would cost millions of dollars to have this kind of online webinar. So what do the laws of zero give you? Well, one of the things it gives you is that all these supercomputers, in terms of smartphones that you have in your pockets, I mean, we went from 0 to billions in zero smartphones to billions in the hands of billions of people in such a short amount of time, in about a decade, right? And that's an example of a disruptive change from the incremental world that we lived in. What else does the laws of zero give us? Well, how many of you have used ChatGPT in the last few months? Right? That's an example of a capability that required trillions of training data tokens, right? A data set with trillions of model parameters, run on cloud computing networks with 10,000 GPUs, resources in exaflops. How many of us can even imagine the number of zeros in an exaflop, going from 0 to 100 million users in just 2 months, and now 1.6 million visits? The technological capability that creates this free tool for us was beyond the imagination of any of the creators of this raw technology. But now it's just right in front of us, right in front of us. And what comes from that kind of technology and comes from that kind of rapid technological change is innovation and disruption in every industry that you can possibly imagine. There probably aren't many people on this webinar that have ever held a Kodak camera, right? Or use camera film for pictures. But just 21 years ago was peak film sales, right? And now Kodak doesn't even exist. All these other companies that used to be at the top of the Fortune 500 list, like Sears and Blockbuster and Nokia, they don't exist. And the kinds of companies now that are the wealthiest um, companies in the world barely existed or didn't exist at all 20 years ago. That kind of disruption can happen. So we think 20 years from now, imagine the kinds of disruption that can happen. But the changes I'm talking about don't happen just in the world of information technology. If you look over the last 20 years at biology and specifically genomics, the ability to read and edit the language of life, it's gotten 1,000,000 times faster and 1,000,000 times cheaper. 1,000,000 times faster in 20 years. In a few years, it will be cheaper to sequence your genome than it will be for you to buy a cup of coffee at Starbucks. That's how cheap it will be. And the consequence of that kind of change means that in 20 years, we have the option, to radically change healthcare from this, just in the US, we spend $4 trillion in healthcare. Most of it's spent on acute care. And 80% of the cost of healthcare today is due to the late stage manifestations of chronic disease. With genomics and personalized healthcare, we can attack those health issues early on, creating better health, better quality of life, and reducing costs for everyone. And the changes are across the board. The price of solar modules in the last 50 years have dropped by almost 100%. It can't be 100%, of course, because it'd be completely free, but 99.6% since 1970. Cost of batteries dropped by 90 in the last 15 years. That means that in the energy industry now, in a lot of parts of the world, it is cheaper. It is cheaper to build a new solar energy plant than it is to operate an existing coal plant. That's the kind of disruption that we're facing. And that's it. Those kinds of technology are driving massive disruption in the transportation industry, right? To move to electric vehicles, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a little bit, is completely enabled by the technological changes and reduced cost that we've experienced in the last 10 years. It would have been astronomically cost-wise prohibitive to build and sell some of these vehicles that are now some of the hottest vehicles, right, in the world. So I want to just take a pause here and do another quick poll, which I'll ask Ricardo to bring up. Looking at the industry that you work in, which are the ones that are sort of most impacting you, have the opportunity to be building blocks that impact your world? Ricardo, you want to bring that poll up? And again, this is unscientific. And it's anonymous, but just want to get a sense of, looking out in your futures, which ones might have a big impact on your world. And let's bring the results so we can see it as they go. Right. Collidic computing and communications, we're sitting right here in the midst of that.
Yeah, let's let a couple more seconds there, everyone. Thank you so much for participating during, I should say, within chat. Very busy in chat, very busy in Q&A. Thank you for participating in the polls. As Chunka mentioned, your information is absolutely anonymous, and we really value that you're responding to the message, right, and the polls that are being provided to you. So I'm going to go ahead and close this out. I'll share the results for us, and back to you, Chunka. There you go.
Thank you. So computing, communications, of course, really, really important information. These things provide sort of the underlying platform, right, for much of what's going on now. And as we move biology and energy into the platform, it'll create even more capabilities. If you live in San Francisco or Phoenix, you can get into a driverless car today, Waymo or Cruise, so many different things happening. But the important thing to remember is that as I talk about these building blocks, right, the building blocks for the future aren't the same as the buildings. We can imagine using these building blocks for so many different possibilities. But we can also imagine using them for awful possibilities, for what we call pathetic futures. Right? In our book, we spend 70,000 words to try to convince the audience about the optimistic outcomes that are possible. But in a few words, I can probably bring up in your mind some of the awful possibilities that we can use these same tools for. Surveillance economy, Big Brother, how we numb ourselves with technology like in Brave New World, how we destroy ourselves with technology like in Dr. Strangelove, how we use these building blocks to increase inequity and drive social disruption, like in The Tale of Two Cities about the French Revolution, Charles Dickens. Or we can ignore the problems that we have, right? Such as dramatically brought out by Don't Look Up. So the pathetic futures are really possible, and they build on the same underlying capability that I just described. So the laws of zero allow us extraordinary opportunity to build futures that we can probably leave to our kids, but it's not guaranteed. So how do we do that? How do we set the right targets? How do we set the right goals to do that? And that brings me to my third lesson, which is to first write your future history. And one of the best examples of a future history that we talk about in the book, and I've talked about in various other settings and videos, is when President John F. Kennedy said at the beginning of the 1960s, we choose to go to the moon by the end of the decade. We choose to go to the moon by the end of the decade. And what Kennedy was doing there in that effort, which came after scientific studies with thousands and thousands of pages, right, looking at the technological capabilities and the motivations for entering the space race, he told a story. He told a story that said, we choose to go to the moon by the end of the decade. And what he did was he set this ambitious yet attainable goal by a very specific date. And he wasn't saying, oh, no matter what happens, we're going to go to the moon. He was saying, we have the future that we desire, right? We have this future that we desire. And here's how I'm going to describe it in a way that I can communicate it to rally the nation around it. And in doing that, right, in setting this vision at a specific time out front, he didn't have to worry about the short-term budget debates. He wasn't trying to make a legislative argument. He wasn't trying to make a political argument. He got it through the short-term noise. And of course, he knew he wasn't going to be president by the end of the decade. But that vision was near enough, right, so that everyone involved could look at the technological components that were being developed and imagine that it was possible. It wasn't so far out and so far-fetched that it was just fiction. It was realistic enough to be technological possible. And then working back from the end of the decade to where he was in time, you could start charting the path to what was necessary to do. And it was clear that what was necessary were still massive innovation, massive development of capabilities and materials and guidance and safety and navigation and computing that wasn't ready yet. This was not going to be done by off-the-shelf software or hardware. It's going to be a lot of innovation involved. But you could still imagine that path working back, and as he said, use it to organize and measure the energies and skills of the different components of government to build that future, starting from that point in the day. So that's what a future history does, right? Rally the right stakeholders around the path to get there. As opposed to what typically happens, and your organizations might do this as well. What typically happens in the planning window is that you go from now to some very specific short-term time. Maybe it's next quarter. If your company is really visionary, maybe it's next year or maybe a couple years out. But it's a short-term window of getting to something very specific. And the problem with that is that if you're looking at just that short-term window, you don't quite know where you're going to get to in the long term. You have this meandering process. So what do you do instead? Well, what we propose in terms of future histories and what we propose in the book is that given the building blocks at your disposal, the first question to ask at some far out date is, what would be ridiculous for us not to have? Put all the sort of self-censoring and constraints aside, given the capabilities that we know are in front of us, what would be ridiculous not to have? And then you can take that vision and work back to your planning day. Right? Then you can ask, what are the milestones? What are the milestones and that you need to get to? And work your way back into the planning window of the things you need to do. So let me give you some examples. Right, today there's moonshots that are a lot harder than sending a human to the moon. One way of looking at that is the UN Sustainable Development Goals around such big issues as poverty, hunger, education, equality, water and sanitation. And of course, one really, really big one is climate action. So how do you take this approach to climate change and dealing with climate change? Well, in our book, we say by 2050, it would be ridiculous if we didn't significantly slow global warming and mitigate the worst effects of climate change. However hard it is, if in 27 years we're not at that point, it would really be silly. So how do we take advantage of the exponential progression of technology to deal with this incremental escalation of climate disruption? Well, one way of breaking down that problem is that if you look at global carbon emissions, transportation represents about 16% of global carbon emissions. We have to deal with all of that. We also have to deal with transportation. If you look at that 16%, about 10 to 12% of the total comes from light duty vehicles, cars, motorcycles, light trucks, and buses. So we have to deal with that. Well, one of the things that we know is that the laws of zero are already enabling viable electric vehicles, right? That it gets to zero emission and that tech capability will change. So over the course of the next 7 years, we have the opportunity of dealing with the 10 to 12% of global emissions that comes from gas-powered vehicles. So what do we do? Well, you're thinking back from 2050. One of the things we have to recognize is it takes a long time to change out all these existing cars. A gas car, once it gets on the road, tends to stay around for about 15 years. It takes about 15 years to rotate the entire set of vehicles out of operation. So if we want to get to all EVs or better by 2050, we know that we can only sell only EVs by 2035, so that between 2035 and 2050, it drives back down. So if we can set a marker for 2035 as only EVs at that point, then we can work backwards to now and say, well, how do we develop the wide set of product offerings that allow us to only sell EVs by 2035? And that kind of thinking is leading to automotive companies saying, well, I'm going to, like General Motors, we're going to sell only electronic vehicles by 2035. That's how they get to 2035. Some others, like Volvo, saying we're going to stop selling gas-powered vehicles by 2030. And once that dynamic starts to happen, then you have this market dynamic that comes into play. Because another way of thinking about what's happening in this realm is that while electric vehicles are only about 3 to 4% of car sales today, what happens in an environment where you see this massive crossover in market share You know, if you know that political dynamics, regulatory dynamics, and consumer preference is driving the market to a whole new set of vehicles, whole new set of product category in the next 15 years or longer, where are you going to place your investments? Right? Do you want to be in that massive market where you're 96% of the sales, but declining, or do you want to be in that tiny market where you're 4% of the sales with the opportunity to get to 80, 90, or 100%? Well, over time, you're going to shift because you have that, you start understanding that that crossover is either opportunity or death for your company. So if you look at market value today, this is why Tesla is worth more essentially than the rest of the automotive companies combined, right? If you look at just GM, Ford, Volkswagen, and Toyota, the four largest automotive companies, they have a combined market value as of yesterday of about $400 billion. As of yesterday, Tesla's worth $935 billion. And that's after a fairly rapid decline, right, from a little bit of time ago. And the reason that they're worth so much is because they sit at the intersection of advantage, purpose, and societal need. Right? Tesla's a great car, but they're not worth this just because it's a great car. They're worth this because it's, for now, the most likely leader in this massive shift from gas-powered cars to electric vehicles, with the massive market opportunity they have in front of us. Right? And that's what's going to drive in the industry inertia in the automotive industry. And that kind of economic dynamic is going to, once we set it in motion, it's going to drive the dynamic across industries. And in the same way that mitigating climate change creates opportunities in the automotive industry and the whole supply chain and value chain that related to it, I think those kinds of opportunities sit everywhere because the tools are becoming available, and economic incentive for using those tools and the market value incentive for deploying those tools are going to cut across every industry. So across all these sustainable development goals, poverty, hunger, health, education, whatever industry that you're sitting in related to these, there are opportunities to take these powerful tools, these powerful building blocks, right, and to deliver to the world viable tools that the world will need, right, and to do well by doing good. That's the opportunity I think that's in front of us. And that's why I think at a personal standpoint, it's an opportunity to get into massive growth areas in almost whatever industry that you're in, or choose to get into a different industry because of these opportunities, rather than sitting on the sidelines or sitting in a place that goes across these headwinds. So in our book, we talk about some of the other sectors in detail that and what kinds of future histories are possible and what would be ridiculous not to have. So in energy, right, by 2050, it would be ridiculous for us not to have clean electricity available to everyone, everywhere, in abundant and affordable quantities, right? Because of the growth in the technology and the capabilities provide us, and the fact that even today, hundreds of millions of people don't have access to or can't afford electricity of any sort. Future history of healthcare, given the tools in front of us, it would be ridiculous not to have terrific healthcare available to everyone at affordable costs. Transportation. Transportation is one of the primary drivers of quality of life and economic well-being. It'd be ridiculous for us not to have inexpensive, widely available access to transportation for everyone. Infrastructure. Robust infrastructure, resilient to man-made and natural threats. And trust. Right? It would be ridiculous if we couldn't deal with the issues in cybersecurity and privacy that we deal with today to mostly guarantee interactions with each other, government organizations, devices in the cloud. It's a whole range of opportunities in front of us. And I think really, wherever you sit, whatever company you work for, whatever industry you work for, these kinds of opportunities are sitting right in front of you. So a future history, and start thinking about it as that slice of the future, right? Where you can start thinking about ambitious and attainable goals, right? You start thinking about what are the narratives of success for yourself and for your organizations in that time, in that future time frame, and then working back today. How do you organize and measure your own energies and skills to connect from today to that future, both on a personal and professional level? So let me just close. 3 questions, right? 3 questions I think all of us have an opportunity to think about for ourselves, right? How do the laws of zero, when you think about these technological capabilities changing at an exponential rate, how do they transform your individual purpose? How might they transform your career? How might you help write the future industry of the future history of your own industry? Because every innovation is about the interaction between individuals, organizations, and governments. And you as an individual have a lot of opportunity in front of you. And what should be on your 3rd list? What should be that list of things you're always keeping an eye on and trying to be opportunistic about in terms of how you shape the future? So with that, we're going to open up some Q&A. I just want to encourage you, hope that you'll take a look at this book, which is available in multiple formats. I want to also invite you to a bi-weekly newsletter that I do on LinkedIn, which is free. And this is my email address, and I welcome your questions, comments, and interactions. Back to you, Ricardo.
Wow. I'm nearly speechless, Chunka. That has been some amazing information that you have provided, not only to our audience. I'm part of the audience in a sense as well, and I'm nearly speechless. There's a lot of pieces of information that you presented to us that are provocative in a positive way. You remind me of something that I heard just this morning. And that was from, a professor, Avi Loeb, if you haven't heard of him before. And I was just listening to him this morning, right? And he said something that definitely resonates with what you're talking about here. That is, we have to embrace the uncomfortable, right? If we think outside of the box, and as scientists, which I'm certainly not, we just always think that we have the answers to everything, and whatever is presented to us where we don't understand, that's the learning opportunity. And I think here is these topics that you are addressing, where naturally people have their opinions. They've been expressing those via chat and Q&A. We don't always have the answers, but what you do have is the ability for us to think about these items that sometimes could be slightly uncomfortable, or we don't have all the answers right now, but at least to consider them. And you have clearly, that is why you have the title of a futurist, is thinking about things that are in our future, right? And there's greatly some change that needs to take place.
Yeah,
awesome information.
I really appreciate that. And the thing is that the world is so complex. We can all find complex problems that we want to work on, and we don't have to work on the same ones,
sure,
right? Because it's a mosaic of a lot of different efforts, and I encourage everyone to not only be against what they want to be against, but find the thing they want to be for and build a future along those lines.
Love it. You have a lot of kudos and love in chat. People have been using reactions, which is a cool thing to do in a webinar, right? It's just, you can see that they're floating away.
Yep. I love that. Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Your entire time that you were presenting, just people really resonating with you, and just some awesome information here. Do you want to answer some questions?
Absolutely.
We don't answer every single one, of course, but I'm just going to pick a few, or if you want to take a look at Q&A yourself and just see, if anything might stand out for you. I'm gonna throw one your way.
Yeah, please do.
And this will be the.
I'll let you drive this part of the conversation.
You got it. Here's one from a participant. How can disruption not have victims? For example, power plants shut down, but no replacement technology is in place. This causes friction of resistance. Not necessarily a question, but something that maybe you could respond to.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think one redeeming factor is that change, large scale change, takes time. And our opportunity is to prepare for change so that we don't have a catastrophic one or overly abrupt one. And to be mindful, to be compassionate about, what will be disrupted. Sometimes change is necessary. For example, there are hundreds of thousands of people that are in the business of responding to car accidents. You got all the way from emergency room doctors to people who take your insurance calls to people who tow your trucks. I want car accidents to go away, right? Those people will lose jobs. I'm really, that's going to happen, and actually sort of needs to happen. But it will happen gradually, and we need to help. We need to help make the transitions happen. So there is no such thing as a jobless change for any innovation. But we hope that they move towards the positive as opposed to the negative.
Yeah. Here's another one for you. Do you think AI government regulations will impede disruptive technologies?
I think that the standards to platform from a regulatory standpoint that we set for any technology is always critical, right? How do we protect the rights of the many against the opportunity for individuals to innovate? And it's a balance. It's a balance. But I think one of the things that government is really important for government to do is to set the standards, right? Set the basics of right and wrong, things like privacy, ownership of data. We have to get those right. And the more impactful a technology is, like AI, the more important it is for us to try to get that right. But the key thing is with an eye towards the outcome. What is the beneficial outcome that we want, and how do we set that? So I'm all for governmental regulation of AI done right.
Yeah.
Right. Because I don't think unfettered technology is ever good, but I also don't think shutting down innovation is good either.
Yeah. Think of Tesla, right? And I mean Nikolai Tesla,
right?
Not the car manufacturer. Here's another one for you. How do you overcome the revenue inertia of energy companies whose profits are tied to continued consumption of fossil fuels?
Oh, I think two things. One is that we have to build the cost of their activities into the pricing model, right? And we have to stimulate the market mechanism so that we can replace those things over time. So in the same way that General Motors has essentially declared it's getting out of the gas-powered car business in 12 years, because it's a better business decision. We want to create the environment. We want to create the environment where energy companies realize it's a better business decision to migrate over time. And a lot of energy companies are doing that. I mean, but it's a strategic choice that they make. Investors should bet on them in the long term or not, based upon the strategic choices they make and how they're going to transition. And as long as we invest enough in the fundamental research and development to create the tools, right, to create the tools that will drive progress, the market can function properly. So I think it's a combination. I think it's a combination of government-funded research, the right regulatory regime, and then the markets doing the scaling.
Yeah. Again, complicated aspects, right, of what we've discussed here and what you've presented to our audience. A lot of information, a lot of questions keep coming in, and I want to address one thing, right? People in Q&A or even in chat were kind of requesting other topics that we weren't necessarily, or that you weren't necessarily addressing today. And first of all, we're only slated for 55 minutes. It's very hard to compact a lot of important, real social topics into one webinar. So we just kindly ask you to appreciate what has been presented to us. There's a lot of awesome information that Chunka had addressed to us. And I hope that's okay to say, and that we can't,
Yeah.
address every single thing that's going on out there in the world, but this is still some useful and beneficial information to all of us.
Well, yeah, definitely.
I'm going to go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say thank you for that. I would say that a number of the questions that that were raised about other areas, other issues, and some of the implications of some things I said, we tried to address in the book. We try to be as thorough and thoughtful as possible. So encourage people to follow through with that.
Thank you. So before we officially close out here, we just want to remind everyone, right? We have been recording this entire webinar for you. We will not be providing the actual presentation deck itself, but of course, you'll have an entire copy of the presentation in the recording, and that will be provided to you. If not today, definitely by tomorrow. Before end of the day, you'll get a follow-up email, and that email will contain a link to the recording. In the recording, the links that I have been sending to you during this session are going to also be provided in the recording. So if you don't click on those links today, that's okay. Just remember to copy them from the chat panel in that recording so that you could paste them into a new browser, and then off you go into those resources. I've provided links to Chunka's website, to a YouTube video, and then some other resources that have been provided. So if you find you don't see them or you're scrolling via chat, just click away. They'll open up for you in a separate browser. But again, they'll be part of the recording. I'm going to pass it back over to you, Chunka, for your final closing, and then I'll go ahead and close this out here.
I mean, not much to say except thank you. Thank you very much for your time. To the point about the presentation, I'm going to put a link to this presentation in my latest Future Perfect newsletter, so you can grab the slides from there if you would like. And please feel free to follow up with me directly if you'd like to.
Awesome. Chunka, it has been an honor and a privilege and pleasure to host you in today's webinar. Thank you so much for delivering this to our audience. I appreciate you very much, and I'll certainly be connecting with you as well. With that being said, everyone, thank you so much for joining us in today's webinar. We know that it was an insightful one for you. We hope to see your names in future sessions. And with that being said, stay happy, healthy, and positive. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.